Well, that's an interesting question. I had wanted to become a general physician because I wasn't interested in any particular specialty. So I applied for various jobs that were in particular specialties like endocrinology, cardiology, gastroenterology, and I never got appointed to a job until I applied for one in respiratory medicine. And the person that interviewed me, who became my mentor, Professor Neil Pride, said, "You really need to do some research if you want to become a consultant." And I was very reluctant to do research because I thought it would waste time in qualifying as a specialist. So he said, "I can arrange for you to do some research with Colin Dollery, who is the professor of clinical pharmacology at the Hammersmith Hospital in London." And so he arranged for me to have a short-term research post to get some research experience before I applied for a clinical post. And then I got interested in research and continued. The area of research I was working in was asthma, which is what the funding was for. But actually, I suffered from asthma as a child, not too badly, but at least I had experience of what an unpleasant disease it was. So I did have a particular interest in asthma at that time and spent many years working on asthma, looking at mechanisms and treatments, and then got into looking at COPD, which was a much more complicated disease and much less understood than asthma. Well, I think it's very important if you want to understand the disease to use different approaches. So, I mean, we were using molecular and cell biology approaches to look at the underlying mechanisms of asthma and subsequently COPD. But we also combined this with other disciplines like clinical medicine, clinical trials, and also working with chemists to look at new approaches to drug molecules. We work with people in physics looking at new optics techniques to visualize cells in the lung. And we also worked with people involved in engineering when we were interested in delivery of inhaled drugs. So I think it's very important to work with other disciplines if you want to find new things and advance understanding of airway disease. Yeah, I think biomarkers are very important because, especially now, we have more specific targeted therapies in order to select the patients who would best respond to specific therapies. So biomarkers still need a lot of development in the area of airway disease, but the biomarker that we worked on in most detail was exhaled nitric oxide. And we did the first studies measuring nitric oxide in the breath and found it to be a very easy measurement for patients to undertake, which meant that it was applicable to children as well as to very ill people. And it turned out to be a very useful biomarker because it was linked to nitric oxide production in eosinophilic inflammation in asthma. So it was a very good biomarker of inflammation in the airways because it was produced by epithelial cells, so you could measure it in the breath. And we did a large number of studies looking at FeNO in asthma under different conditions after allergen exposure and acute exacerbations. But I think most important is that we were able to show it was suppressed by inhaled steroids. So it's a very good biomarker for measuring response to anti-inflammatory treatment in asthma. And it also had application in other disease. It was not so useful in COPD because the levels are reduced in COPD because of the high amount of oxidative stress in the lung. But FeNO is a good example of a biomarker that can be developed commercially and is now widely available and used. So it can be used for diagnosis, for monitoring patients, and to look at their response to treatment. And it may be useful in the future for developing new treatments. So it's been a very useful biomarker. And other biomarkers in the breath are also now being investigated in more detail. We looked at carbon monoxide several years ago, but that turned out not to be such a useful biomarker because cigarette smoke would interfere with it and environmental exposure would affect the measurements. But many people now are looking at volatile organic compounds in the breath, and I think in the future they may turn out to be useful for diagnosing particular phenotypes of disease and monitoring response to treatment. So I think that a lot more research is needed into biomarkers for the future. Well, I think this is a very important area of research. So at the moment, the treatments are symptomatic of bronchodilators and are not really having an important effect on the underlying disease process. So we need to find effective anti-inflammatory treatments that are also safe. And many drugs have been evaluated, and either they are ineffective or they have side effects that would limit the use of these drugs in long-term treatment. So we really need to look for new anti-inflammatory treatments that would work in COPD. And people are looking at some new targets like JAK and IRAK4. So there are some new targets that people are looking at because there are now inhibitors of these targets. But it's been very challenging to find anti-inflammatory drugs that are either effective and safe. And so it's going to be difficult to find something. I mean, the area that we're working on in a search for new treatments is cellular senescence, which we think is a very important driving mechanism for the inflammation of COPD and also for the comorbidities associated with COPD. So I think that could be a very promising area. And there are several new drugs now that are being developed that target cellular senescence. The most promising drugs, I think, are the ones that get rid of senescent cells, which are called senolytic drugs. And several senolytic drugs are in development, and some are being given in clinical studies in other age-related diseases. So I think that's quite a promising area for the future. Well, obviously, avoiding exposure to irritants in the airway, air pollution, smoking, obviously, but so clean air is very important because I think most COPD is due to exposure to oxidants in the air. But I think diet is also probably a very important factor in development of COPD and its progression. And we know that the diet, healthy diets contain antioxidants that counteract oxidative stress from the environment. But also we now know that healthy diets with fruit and vegetables, for example, contain substances that are anti-aging. Not only antioxidants, but drugs that can have senolytic effects, as I'd mentioned in the previous answer. So I think there's good evidence that healthy diets can protect against COPD, and we know that diets high in fruit and vegetables reduce the decline in lung function. So I think we need to educate people to avoid bad air and to eat good food. Well, I think collaboration with industry is very important. I mean, academics can have ideas, but it's very difficult to develop these into a therapy. So they need to work closely with industry. I mean, it's a very important partnership because industry needs academia as well for developing ideas. So we've always worked very closely with different pharmaceutical companies, and they've always been extremely valuable collaborations because they have great knowledge and they have technologies that we don't have. So we've found it very fruitful to collaborate with industry over many years. Well, I think it's well known that many doctors don't follow guidelines, especially in general practice where most asthma and COPD is managed. And many doctors are following the same treatments they were taught about in medical school. So it takes a long time to change medical practice in the real world. I mean, a very good example is inhaled steroids being overused in COPD patients because it was always thought inhaled steroids would be useful in COPD as they are in asthma, since COPD involves inflammation of the airways like asthma, but the inflammation is very different and it's largely unresponsive to steroids. So steroids are not only ineffective, they may even cause harm. And we know that inhaled steroids can cause pneumonia as well as metabolic side effects in patients with COPD. So it's important not to use inhaled steroids where they're not going to be useful. There are some patients with COPD who may benefit from inhaled steroids in that they can reduce exacerbations, but probably only about 10 to 20% of COPD patients will show benefit from steroids. And yet inhaled steroids, at least in the UK, are given to about 90% of patients with COPD. And I think this is something that is not improving because people now commonly use triple inhalers that contain an inhaled steroid with 2 bronchodilators as the first treatment for COPD. So every patient gets started on inhaled steroids. And this is quite wrong because it actually may lead to harm of the patient. Well, I think that the important thing about the COVID-19 epidemic is that a lot of resources were put into respiratory research. So that helped to improve understanding of virus-mediated lung diseases. But one of the things that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic was that exacerbations of asthma and COPD were markedly reduced. I mean, there are almost no hospital admissions. And that was evidence that virus transmission is very important for acute exacerbations, and that avoiding contact with other people and wearing face masks may be very protective. So this is an important lesson, because we can markedly reduce exacerbations in COPD by making sure patients are not exposed to viruses in the atmosphere. Well, I think that the area where we made a lot of important discoveries was understanding how corticosteroids work in asthma as anti-inflammatory treatments, and the molecular mechanisms that steroids are inducing to switch off activated inflammatory genes in the airways. So I think that was important, because it led us to understand mechanisms of steroid resistance in COPD. So what we found is that high levels of oxidative stress inactivate the molecular pathways that steroids are using to switch off inflammation, which is why the inflammation of COPD is steroid resistant. So I think that was important, and it led to thinking about how you might be able to reverse steroid resistance. We tried to do this with theophylline, which seemed to work in vitro, but unfortunately, clinical trials of theophylline that we undertook we were not able to demonstrate that we could reverse steroid resistance, at least in COPD patients in clinical trials. But I think it's still something that should be investigated to find out how you might reverse steroid resistance. The area that we're working on now is cellular senescence, as I mentioned earlier, which we think is a very important driving mechanism. So we're trying to understand the mechanisms of cellular senescence, how we can stop this, and in particular, how senescence can spread. So we've shown that cellular senescence can be transmitted by microRNAs in extracellular vesicles, which are produced by COPD cells and can then be taken up by other cells, which are then induced to become senescent. But these vesicles can travel into the circulation, so that the senescence can actually spread beyond the lung to the cardiovascular system, the kidneys, etc. And so this could account for the comorbidities that are very commonly found in COPD. So when we see a patient with COPD, over 90% of them have 2 or more comorbidities that are usually age-related diseases as well. And so the prospect for the future is that we should be able to treat COPD and all of its comorbidities with a single treatment that targets this cellular senescence mechanism. So that's an important direction for the future, I think. Well, I think it's important to encourage people to go into respiratory research. It's very difficult to get funding for respiratory research. So we do need a lot more public attention on respiratory medicine, which has been rather neglected compared with areas like cancer and cardiovascular and neurological diseases. So I think we need to be much better at getting across the importance of respiratory medicine to the general public, in order to increase the amount of research funding, because there are so many important questions that need to be addressed in respiratory medicine. and they are amongst the most important diseases that humans suffer from. And in general practice, asthma and COPD are amongst the commonest diseases that doctors will see. So they're very important diseases, and we need a lot more research, and we need to find better treatments for the future, and we need to find cures for these chronic diseases so that we can switch them off permanently. And that involves a lot more research and a lot more funding.